Have you ever watched an anime or read a manga and thought to yourself, why do I love these characters so much when they are clearly an absolute disaster together? That strange feeling, that mix of fascination and discomfort, is exactly what we are going to break down today. Toxic couples in manga and anime are so much more than just a bad narrative choice. They are a literary tool as old as storytelling itself, used with varying degrees of skill and self-awareness. And they say something deeply revealing about ourselves and about human relationships. But before we dive into the heart of it, let us ask a fundamental question. Why are we drawn to these love stories that fall apart? Why do we keep reading, keep watching, keep emotionally investing in relationships that in real life we would tell our friends to run from? The answer is both simple and fascinating. Fiction allows us to experience emotionally intense situations from the safety of our couch. We can feel passion, jealousy, manipulation, tragedy, without ever having to deal with the real consequences. And toxic romances are the absolute champions of emotional intensity. Let's start with something relatively light, or at least as light as this topic allows. There is a category of toxic couples in manga that operates on an essentially comedic register. The principle is simple. Two characters with completely incompatible personalities end up together, and their constant friction generates both laughter and a kind of romantic tension. It is a narrative mechanism that has existed for centuries. Shakespeare was already using it in The Taming of the Shrew in the 17th century. In manga, the most iconic archetype of this dynamic is City Hunter. The protagonist is a shameless pervert who makes absolutely no effort to hide his intentions. His partner lets him know how she feels in a fairly direct way, usually with an oversized mallet. In real life, that would be a police report. In the cartoonish context of the series, it is funny, and that is the whole nuance. Toxicity, as comedic fuel, only works when it is treated in a clearly exaggerated, clearly unrealistic register where nobody is supposed to see it as a model to follow. You find the same logic in Toradora, with two characters of impossible temperament who clash constantly before realizing they have feelings for each other. The conflict is there, the tension is there, but the narrative frame makes it clear that we are in romantic comedy territory. It is an honest way to use toxicity to make people laugh, not to seduce them. But things get truly interesting when a couple's toxicity is no longer just a comedic device, but becomes the engine of real dramatic tension. And for that, we need to talk about a manga that defined an entire generation of readers with one of the most complex and painful relationships ever written in the medium. Fruits Basket. In this series, two characters become entangled in a relationship that starts with a beautiful appearance and gradually reveals itself as a genuine emotional minefield. Akito, the head of the Soma family, carries years of manipulation, isolation, and unprocessed wounds. And Shigure is no better. If Akito only knows how to express what she feels through violence or control, Shigure has chosen an even more twisted path: cold, calculated manipulation. When he discovers that Akito slept with one of their cousins to keep them within her sphere of influence, his response is to sleep with Akito's mother out of revenge. That is not love. It is not even hate. It is a power struggle where real feelings are used as weapons to wound the other person. And yet, what makes this couple fascinating, rather than simply repulsive, is that the series takes the time to explain why these two people became who they are. Akito grew up in a gilded prison, worshipped like a deity but deprived of any normal human connection. She never learned to ask for what she wanted with words. She only learned to possess, to control. And Shigure, on his side, has so thoroughly internalized the power games of this dysfunctional family that he is no longer capable of expressing anything directly. What Fruits Basket tells us through them is something profoundly true. unresolved emotional wounds transform into relational toxicity. And sometimes, all it takes is for one person to learn to put their feelings into words, for things to begin to change. That same idea of an emotional imbalance, quietly corroding a relationship from within, is what you find in the dynamic between Sasuke and Sakura in Naruto. But here, unfortunately, the narrative potential is largely wasted. The problem is not the archetype itself. The brooding bad boy and the girl who loves him anyway can absolutely work. It has worked in other stories. But for it to work, both characters need a genuine emotional life, credible reactions, visible growth. In Naruto, Sakura stays frozen. Sasuke flees the village, becomes a criminal, takes part in massacres, and she loves him anyway, without the series ever truly showing us the internal battle that should be tearing her apart. We are told she suffers, but we never actually feel it. And when Sasuke returns after years of violent crime, the manga puts them together without a single moment of reconstruction, of honesty, of real work between them. It is frustrating because you can feel that something genuinely interesting could have been there, but the writing just was not there to make it real. So let us talk about a series that managed to do exactly what Naruto failed to do with its romantic characters. Nana. And I say this without hesitation. Nana contains one of the best written toxic love stories in the entire medium. Ren and Nana meet young, and they collide with all the violence of a first absolute love. Everything separates them, their visions of life, their ideas about the future, their relationship to freedom. But what brings them together is something deeper and darker than simple attraction. Both of them carry wounds of abandonment. One was left on the doorstep of a warehouse as a child. The other was abandoned by her mother and raised in a violent environment. And those wounds, unhealed and unspoken, are going to poison everything they try to build together. Their biggest problem is that they unconsciously idolize a destructive relationship model. They romanticize the idea of dying together, of pushing love to its most extreme limits. And when Ren receives a major professional opportunity and chooses to take it without really consulting Nana, without seeing that she needed to hear, "Don't leave me out loud," everything starts to crack. Years later, when they meet again, the passion comes back instantly. But so do the insecurities, the jealousy, the codependency, the things left unsaid that keep accumulating. And on top of all that, addiction issues and media pressure prevent them from ever just being two people who love each other. What makes Nana extraordinary is that everything feels inevitable. You watch the gears turn, you understand why every bad decision gets made, and you can't really blame either of them, because you understand their fears, their blind spots, their emotional gaps. That is the mark of great writing. It makes a toxic relationship feel tragic rather than simply condemnable. Let's shift gears now. There is a type of toxic couple that operates on an entirely different mechanism. The relationship where one partner sees the other purely as a tool. In anime, the most iconic example of that dynamic is Light and Misa in Death Note. Misa is what internet culture would call a simp, someone who gives absolute, unconditional love to a person who feels absolutely nothing in return. Light Yagami sees her only as a weapon. She possesses an exceptional power, the ability to see anyone's name and remaining lifespan, and he agrees to date her solely to exploit that ability for his own ends. He directs her every move, and he manipulates her with surgical precision. Blinded by her feelings, she even sacrifices half of her own lifespan to be useful to him. Twice. What's fascinating about this couple is that both characters are clearly dysfunctional, but in radically different ways. Light is a cold, calculating manipulator with no real empathy for anyone, Misa has something of an obsessive stalker about her, an attachment that far exceeds anything we would consider healthy. Neither one is a role model, but together, they perfectly serve the mechanics of the story. Without Misa's blind obsession, entire arcs of Death Note lose their tension. Their toxicity is not there to seduce the audience. It is there to drive a cat-and-mouse narrative forward. That is an honest and effective use of a toxic couple in service of storytelling. Now let's talk about a couple that generated a lot of passionate debate in the community. Eren and Mikasa in Attack on Titan. Their relationship is complex because it is built on something that could look like love, but is in reality a form of pathological codependency reinforced by purely biological elements. Mikasa, as an Ackerman, is genetically predisposed to bond with one person and protect that person at the cost of her own life. That removes some of the voluntary nature from her feelings. Eren knows this. He knows she will always be there. He knows she will always follow. And for years he takes advantage of it. He takes reckless risks and makes catastrophic choices, knowing she will be there to pick up the pieces. There is even a point in the series where he deliberately wounds her with words, knowing exactly what impact that will have. And yet the writing of their relationship works precisely because the series never pretends any of this is romantic. It shows us the consequences. It shows us a Mikasa whose entire identity has been built around one single person, to the point where she struggles to exist for herself. And it shows us an Eren who uses that attachment as a safety net. This is not a beautiful love story. It is a portrait of a relationship that has suffocated both of the people it was supposed to unite. But if Eren and Mikasa represent a relatively nuanced and self-aware form of toxicity, there are far more bluntly problematic examples in the manga world. We need to talk about them, not to glorify them, but precisely because we cannot fully understand this phenomenon without looking at it directly. There is a whole category of works that uses toxicity not as a narrative or critical tool, but as pure thrill fuel for a young and sometimes uncritical audience. And that is where things get significantly more serious. The Wolf Girl and the Black Prince is a telling example. The relationship it depicts is born from a lie, built on blackmail, and evolves through a steady series of humiliations and manipulations. The male character systematically exploits the protagonist's insecurities. The core problem is that this toxicity is never really challenged by the narrative itself. It is presented, sometimes even wrapped in appealing packaging, without ever being named for what it is. This type of story primarily reaches a teenage audience that can find in these narratives an emotional outlet. That outlet function is not trivial. Catharsis, the literary principle of allowing the reader to experience intense emotions within a safe fictional space in order to process them, is a legitimate function of storytelling. But it becomes problematic when it operates without any clear signal that what is being depicted is dysfunctional. Younger or less experienced readers can internalize these dynamics as normal or even as signs of passionate love. And that is where fiction without critical self-awareness can become genuinely harmful. The isekai genre, stories in which a character is transported to another world, offers particularly fertile ground for this kind of issue. Take Mushoku Tensei, often praised as a benchmark isekai for the depth of its world building. Its protagonist, Rudeus, is a deeply problematic character whose behavior toward women, including patterns of assault and voyeurism, is systematically minimized by the narrative. His victims forgive him with troubling speed. His behavior sometimes becomes the very reason female characters develop feelings for him. And the promise of redemption rings hollow because he never genuinely questions the nature of his actions. This pattern reveals something broader about a category of isekai, the idea that the male protagonist's suffering entitles him to the female characters around him. Love becomes a reward earned through suffering, rather than a feeling built between two equal people. And women become targets to be achieved rather than beings with their own inner lives. It is a particularly damaging message when it is directed at a young audience and never explicitly challenged by the story. ReZero presents a similar protagonist in Subaru, a character who openly simps for Emilia and frames his constant self-sacrifice as a form of romantic debt. He suffers, therefore he deserves to be loved. He dedicates himself, therefore he has claims on her. Even when the series confronts Subaru with some of his flaws, he inevitably falls back into the same patterns. The story keeps presenting him as indispensable, as a savior, without ever truly questioning the relational logic he embodies. Now let's talk about a mangaka who understood all of this and decided to use it in a radically different way. Tatsuki Fujimoto, the creator of Chainsaw Man and Fire Punch, is deeply fascinated by toxic dynamics. But unlike many of his contemporaries, he does not use them to seduce or to flatter his audience's fantasies. He uses them to expose, to punish, and to deconstruct. In Chainsaw Man, Denji is a character who has known nothing but misery. No childhood, no friends, no emotional reference points. He arrives at adulthood with very simple, almost naive desires, including relationships with women. And every single time he pursues those desires purely on instinct, without really thinking, without really seeing the other person in their full complexity, it goes badly. Fujimoto seems to take deliberate pleasure in punishing every moment where Denji thinks with his impulses rather than his emotional intelligence. This is not cheap moralizing. It is storytelling that says clearly, human relationships are complicated, and approaching them as if they are not has consequences. Makima, the central female character of Chainsaw Man's first part, is frequently misread by a portion of the audience who present her as a fascinating and desirable figure. But that misreading is precisely what Fujimoto is exposing. Makima is the embodiment of a system of total domination. She sees Denji only as a tool. She shapes his desires, controls his fears, manipulates his every choice. And the series shows us what it does to a person to be so completely stripped of their autonomy. This is not a love story. It is a critique of the way certain relationships annihilate the identity of one of the people involved. That's the fundamental difference between a work that uses relational toxicity with genuine intelligence and a work that simply stages it without looking it in the eye. The first one teaches us something. It makes us reflect on our own blind spots, on the mechanisms that allow destructive relationships to persist, on what unresolved suffering does to human beings, and the way they love. The second one delivers an intense sensation, an easy tension, but never once invites us to look at what we're actually consuming. And that's ultimately the central question raised by this entire category of storytelling. Not do toxic couples have a place in fiction? Because the answer is clearly yes. They have been part of storytelling since Greek tragedy. They fascinate us because they speak to something real. The fact that human relationships can be both a source of love and a source of destruction. That unhealed wounds get passed on. That communication, or the absence of it, can change the entire course of a life. The real question is, what does a story do with that toxicity? Does it present it as inevitable and romantic? Or does it show it for what it actually is, a warning sign, a consequence, something that deserves to be seen, understood, and moved beyond? The best stories that deal with toxic couples do not make you want to live what they depict. They make you want to understand how people end up there. And maybe, if you recognize yourself in some of the patterns they show, they give you something to think about. Because when you get down to it, maybe that is the real power of a well-written manga. Not to hand you a model to follow, but to hold up a mirror and to let you decide what you want to do with what you see. So tell me in the comments, is there a manga or anime couple that you found compelling, even knowing it was clearly toxic? And do you think fiction has a responsibility in how it represents these dynamics? I read everything, and let's keep this conversation going down below.